The candles in the grand ballroom burned bright, but Edmund Vane, Earl of Ashford, felt only cold. He stood near the tall marble pillars, his cane pressed hard against the polished floor, while laughter rippled across the room like a wave that never seemed to stop. Somewhere behind a painted fan, a young woman whispered to her friend, and both of them turned to look at him before dissolving into giggles. Edmund did not need to hear the words. He already knew what they were saying. He had heard some version of it at every ball for the last 3 years. The lame Earl, the broken soldier who could barely walk, let alone dance. The man whose title was grand but whose leg had been shattered on a battlefield far from this warm, glittering room. He shifted his weight, trying to ease the ache that never truly left him, and glanced toward the dance floor. Couples spun beneath the chandeliers, silk skirts flashing gold and rose in the candlelight, and for a moment Edmund allowed himself to imagine what it might feel like to join them. Then a sharp twinge shot up from his knee to his hip, and the memory of the battlefield returned, quick and unwelcome, the way it always did. It had happened 2 years ago, during a skirmish that should never have gone as badly as it did. A cannon blast had thrown him from his horse, and when he woke, the surgeon told him plainly that he was fortunate to keep the leg at all. Fortunate. That was the word the man had used, as though a shattered bone and a permanent limp were gifts to be grateful for. Edmund had learned to walk again, slowly, painfully, with the help of a cane he now carried everywhere. But he had never learned to walk into a ballroom without feeling every eye upon him. Tonight was no different. Lord and Lady Camden were hosting one of the largest balls of the season, and half the nobility of the county had turned out in their finest clothes to see and be seen. Edmund had almost stayed home, as he usually did, but his mother had insisted. She worried that if he continued to hide himself away, the gossip would only grow crueler, and so, against his own judgment, he had come. He wished now that he had trusted his instincts. Across the room, a group of young gentlemen stood near the refreshment table, glasses of punch in their hands, watching him with the particular kind of amusement that young men reserve for anyone weaker than themselves. One of them, a broad-shouldered fellow named Peregrine Ashby, raised his glass in a mocking salute. "Lord Ashford," Peregrine called, his voice carrying easily over the music. "Will you not honor us with a dance tonight? I hear the ladies are simply desperate for a partner." A ripple of laughter followed. Edmund felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his face still. He had learned over the past 2 years that the worst thing he could do was show how deeply the words landed. If he showed pain, they would only aim more carefully next time. "I am content to watch," Edmund replied evenly. "Someone must appreciate the music after all." It was a weak reply, and he knew it, but it was enough to make Peregrine lose interest and turn back to his friends. Edmund exhaled slowly and moved toward the edge of the room, seeking the relative safety of the shadows near the tall windows. From there, he could watch the dancing without becoming its subject. It was there, in the dim light near the heavy velvet curtains, that he first noticed her. She was not dancing either. She stood a little apart from a cluster of older women, her hands folded neatly in front of her, watching the room with an expression that seemed both amused and faintly tired, as though she had seen this exact scene many times before and found it a little dull. She wore a gown of deep green, simple compared to the elaborate silks around her, but it suited her far better than anything more extravagant would have. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that was neither fashionable nor unfashionable, simply practical, and there was something in the set of her shoulders that suggested she was used to being overlooked and had decided long ago not to mind. Edmund recognized her, though he had never spoken to her. Miss Eleanor Hartley. He had heard her name mentioned once or twice, always with a note of pity in the speaker's voice. 28 years old and still unmarried, the whispers said. A spinster, though a pretty one, which somehow made it worse in the eyes of society, as though her beauty were being wasted on no one. Edmund found himself watching her a moment longer than was polite. There was something different about the way she stood there, something that did not match the pity others seemed to feel for her. She looked, if anything, entirely at peace with her own company. Then, as though she felt his gaze, she turned her head and looked directly at him. Edmund froze, caught in the act of staring, and braced himself for the usual reaction. The quick averted eyes, the polite but distant nod, the subtle turning away that told him without words that he had been dismissed as unworthy of further attention. Instead, Miss Hartley held his gaze for a long moment, and then, to his great surprise, she offered him a small, genuine smile. It was such an unexpected thing that Edmund did not know how to respond. He managed a stiff nod in return, and then, embarrassed by his own awkwardness, he looked away first, pretending sudden interest in the musicians at the far end of the room. When he glanced back a few seconds later, she had already turned to speak with one of the older women beside her, as though nothing had happened at all. Edmund told himself it meant nothing. A polite smile between strangers at a crowded ball was hardly remarkable, and yet, for reasons he could not quite explain, the small warmth of it stayed with him for the rest of the evening, a single point of light in a room that had otherwise offered him nothing but cold amusement at his expense. The dancing continued for another hour. Edmund remained near the windows, occasionally exchanging brief words with an old friend from his regiment days, a quiet, kind man named Frederick Lowe, who had lost 2 fingers in the same conflict that had taken Edmund's mobility, and who understood, better than most, what it was to be looked at differently after returning home. "You should not let them trouble you so much," Frederick said at one point, following Edmund's gaze toward the group of young men who had mocked him earlier. "Ashby is a fool. Everyone with sense knows it." "Everyone with sense is not the one laughing," Edmund replied. Frederick had no answer for that, and the 2 men fell into a comfortable silence, watching the dancers spin beneath the golden light. Later, as the evening wore toward its close and guests began drifting toward the refreshment room for a final round of conversation before their carriages arrived, Edmund found himself unexpectedly close to Miss Hartley near the long table set with cakes and cordials. She was speaking quietly with an elderly gentleman about a book of poetry, her voice low and pleasant, her manner unhurried. When the gentleman moved away to greet another acquaintance, Edmund found himself, almost without deciding to, standing nearby. "Lord Ashford," she said, noticing him at last, and to his relief there was no pity in her voice, only simple recognition. "I do not believe we have been introduced." "We have not," Edmund admitted. "Though I confess I have heard your name mentioned this evening." Something flickered across her face, quick and guarded, and Edmund immediately regretted his choice of words. He had not meant to remind her of the gossip that surely followed her as closely as it followed him. "I imagine you have," she said, her tone carefully light. "I am something of a subject of interest myself, though not, I think, for reasons either of us would choose." Edmund studied her for a moment, surprised by her directness. Most people, when confronted with an awkward truth, chose to dance around it with polite nonsense. Miss Hartley, it seemed, preferred to name it outright and move on. "No," he agreed slowly. "I do not suppose either of us chose this particular kind of attention." She looked at him then, really looked, in a way that made Edmund feel, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he was being seen as a person rather than a curiosity. There was no flicker of discomfort in her eyes when they moved briefly to his cane, no forced brightness meant to cover pity. She simply looked at him as though he were, quite ordinarily, a man standing in a room full of cake and candlelight. "I saw you earlier," she said. "Near the windows, you looked as though you would rather be anywhere else." Edmund allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Is it so obvious?" "Only to someone who feels much the same way," she replied. Before either of them could say more, a bright, cheerful voice called Elinor's name from across the room, and she turned to see her aunt beckoning her toward the door, signaling that their carriage had arrived. Elinor glanced back at Edmund with something like reluctance. "It was a pleasure, Lord Ashford," she said, "truly." "The pleasure was mine, Miss Hartley," Edmund replied, and found to his own surprise that he meant it entirely. She offered him one last small smile before turning to join her aunt, her green gown disappearing into the crowd of departing guests. Edmund remained by the refreshment table a moment longer, turning their brief conversation over in his mind. It had been such a small thing, only a few minutes of polite talk between two people who had never met before. And yet Edmund could not remember the last time a conversation at a ball had left him feeling anything other than exhausted or humiliated. Miss Hartley had done neither. She had simply spoken to him, plainly and honestly, as though his leg and his cane and his 3 years of quiet suffering were facts about him and nothing more, no different from the color of his eyes or the sound of his voice. As he made his slow way toward his own carriage a short while later, leaning more heavily on his cane than he liked to admit after a long evening on his feet, Edmund found himself thinking, against his better judgment, that he hoped he might see Miss Elinor Hartley again. He told himself it was nothing. A single kind conversation did not undo 3 years of whispered cruelty, and he had no reason to believe that the next time they met, if there was a next time, would be any different from tonight's brief exchange. And yet, as the carriage rattled through the dark streets toward home, Edmund found that the memory of her steady, unpitying gaze had done something no amount of mockery ever had. It had made him want to attend another ball. Elinor Hartley had not always been called a spinster. There had been a time, nearly 10 years earlier, when she was considered one of the brightest young women to enter society, with a quick mind, a warm laugh, and a face that turned heads in every drawing room she entered. Her mother had been certain back then that Elinor would marry well within her first season. Instead, 10 years had passed, and Elinor remained unmarried, a fact that seemed to trouble everyone in her family far more than it troubled her. It was not that no one had asked. In fact, Elinor had received 3 proposals of marriage over the years, each from a respectable gentleman with a respectable income, and each time, to her family's great frustration, she had refused. The first had come when she was 19, from a wealthy merchant's son named Simon Fairweather, a pleasant enough young man who spoke often of horses and very little of anything else. Elinor had liked him well enough as a friend, but when he proposed, kneeling awkwardly in her father's drawing room with a ring he had clearly chosen without much thought, she realized with sudden clarity that he wanted a wife the way he wanted a fine horse or a well-cut coat, as something to complete a picture rather than someone to know. She had refused him gently, and he had married another young lady within the year, seemingly without much heartbreak on either side. The second proposal came when she was 23, from a widowed baron nearly twice her age who made no secret of the fact that he wanted a mother for his 4 children, rather than a wife in any true sense of the word. He had been kind in his own distant way, but Elinor had spent one long afternoon at his estate watching him speak to his children with the same polite indifference he showed his servants, and she had known, without needing to be told, exactly what her life would become if she accepted him. The third proposal, the one her family still spoke of with quiet bitterness, had come when she was 26, from a young gentleman named Peregrine Ashby, the very same man who had mocked Edmund so cruelly at Lord Camden's ball. Peregrine had courted her for nearly a season, all charm and flattering words, and Elinor had almost convinced herself that perhaps this time it might be different. Then, quite by accident, she had overheard him laughing with his friends about her considerable inheritance, boasting that marrying a spinster with money was far easier than courting a younger woman with expectations of romance. Elinor had refused him within the week, and Peregrine, stung and embarrassed, had spent the years since making certain that everyone in their social circle understood that she was proud, difficult, and unlikely ever to receive another offer worth having. It was, Elinor often thought, a strange kind of punishment to be mocked for refusing men who did not truly want her, and then mocked further for remaining unmarried as a result. But she had made her peace with it, or told herself she had. Her father had passed 2 years earlier, leaving her a modest but comfortable independence, and her mother, though she still sighed heavily at the mention of every ball Elinor attended without securing an engagement, had largely given up hope of seeing her married at all. Elinor's aunt, Margaret Hartley, a sharp-tongued widow who had taken to living with the family after her own husband's death, was perhaps the only person who understood Elinor's choices without judgment. It was Aunt Margaret who had accompanied her to Lord Camden's ball, and it was Aunt Margaret who noticed, on the carriage ride home, that Elinor seemed unusually thoughtful. "You spoke with Lord Ashford," Margaret observed, watching her niece's face carefully in the dim light of the carriage lamp. "The Earl with the cane." "I did," Elena admitted, "only for a few minutes." "And—" Elena considered the question for a long moment before answering. "He did not look at me the way most men do," she said finally. "As though I were a puzzle to be solved, or a prize to be won, or a problem to be managed. He simply looked at me as though I were a person standing in front of him." Margaret raised an eyebrow but said nothing more, though the small, knowing smile that touched her lips suggested she had drawn her own conclusions. Over the following days, however, Elena found that a single quiet conversation could carry a surprising weight through the gossip channels of society. It seemed that several guests had noticed her speaking with Lord Ashford near the refreshment table, and by the time a week had passed, half the drawing rooms in the county had heard some version of the story, most of them considerably exaggerated. "I heard," said Mrs. Caroline Beaumont, a neighbor known for her enthusiastic interest in other people's business, during a visit to the Hartley home, "that Lord Ashford scarcely left your side the entire evening." "That is not at all what happened," Elena replied, keeping her tone light despite her irritation. "We spoke for perhaps 10 minutes. 10 minutes is a very long time for a man like that," Mrs. Beaumont said meaningfully, and Elena understood exactly what she meant by it, though she chose not to respond. The gossip did not trouble Elena as much as she suspected it was meant to. She had grown accustomed over the years to being discussed as though her own feelings and choices were public property, and she had developed a certain resilience to it. What did surprise her in the days that followed was how often her thoughts returned to Lord Ashford himself, unbidden, at odd moments throughout her day. She thought of him while reading in the small parlor that served as her favorite retreat, remembering the steady, unflinching way he had looked at her, without a trace of the pity she so often saw in the eyes of others when they learned her age and her unmarried state. She thought of him while walking in the garden behind her family's townhouse, recalling the tired, dry humor in his voice when he had admitted that he too would rather have been anywhere else that evening. She thought of him, most unexpectedly, while helping her younger cousin Grace practice her needlework, when Grace mentioned, quite innocently, that she had heard the Earl of Ashford rarely attended social events anymore, and wondered aloud why that might be. "Perhaps," Elena said carefully, "he simply grew tired of being unkindly treated by people who ought to know better." Grace, only 16, and not yet burdened by the particular cruelties of adult society, considered this with the serious frown of a young person encountering a new and troubling idea for the first time. "That seems very unfair," she said. "He did not choose to be injured." "No," Elena agreed quietly, "he did not." It was around this time that Elena began to notice something she had not expected. Whenever her family discussed the upcoming social season, the various balls and dinners and garden parties that filled the calendar of the wealthy and titled, Elena found herself hoping, with a persistence that surprised her, that Lord Ashford might be in attendance. It was a foolish hope, she told herself. A single kind conversation at a crowded ball meant nothing, and she had no reason to believe that Edmund Vane thought of her at all beyond that one brief exchange. And yet, when an invitation arrived a fortnight later for a garden party to be held at the estate of Viscount Pemberton, one of the largest and most celebrated social gatherings of the early summer season, Elena found herself dressing with unusual care, and could not entirely convince herself that her reasons had nothing to do with the possibility of seeing him there. Her mother, noticing the new ribbon Elena had chosen for her bonnet and the extra time spent before the looking-glass, said nothing directly, but the small, curious smile she wore throughout breakfast suggested she had noticed the change as well, and was choosing, wisely, not to comment on it. As the carriage carried Elena and her mother toward Pemberton's grand estate that afternoon, past rolling green lawns and tall hedgerows just beginning to bloom, Elena found herself watching the passing scenery without truly seeing it, her mind occupied instead with a single quiet question she could not quite set aside. Would he be there? Viscount Pemberton's garden party was, by every measure that mattered to the fashionable world, a great success. The lawn stretched wide and green beneath a clear summer sky, dotted with white pavilions where guests gathered to take tea and exchange the latest gossip, while a small orchestra played softly near the rose garden, and servants moved between the crowds carrying trays of lemonade and delicate cakes. It was exactly the sort of gathering Edmund usually avoided, preferring the relative privacy of his own estate to the exposed, wandering nature of an outdoor party, where there was no corner dark enough to disappear into and no wall to lean against unnoticed. He had almost declined the invitation entirely. It was only a small, persistent hope, one he barely admitted to himself, that had finally convinced him to attend. He told himself it was simply his mother's continued insistence that he not withdraw entirely from society, but as his carriage rolled up the long gravel drive toward Pemberton's estate, Edmund knew, with some embarrassment, that he was thinking of green silk and dark hair, and a smile that had not once flickered with pity. The party was already well underway by the time he arrived, and Edmund made his way carefully across the lawn, grateful that the soft grass, while somewhat more difficult to navigate with his cane than a smooth ballroom floor, at least offered him the freedom to move at his own pace without the eyes of an entire room fixed upon him at once. He found a quiet spot near the edge of the rose garden, close enough to the gathering to be considered present, far enough to avoid becoming its center of attention, and settled onto a low stone bench beneath the shade of an old oak tree. It was there, nearly an hour later, that he saw her. Elinor was walking along the garden path with her mother and a small group of other ladies, nodding politely at the conversation around her, though Edmund could see even from a distance that her attention was elsewhere, drifting toward the roses, the trees, the wide open sky above them. When the group paused near a fountain to admire the water lilies, Elinor seemed to seize the opportunity, murmuring something to her mother before slipping away from the group entirely and wandering deeper into the garden alone. Edmund watched her go, torn between the urge to remain quietly in his corner, as he usually did, and a stronger, less familiar urge to follow. In the end, it was not entirely his decision to make. Elinor's path curved naturally toward the very rose garden where he sat, and within a few minutes, she rounded a tall hedge and found herself standing almost directly in front of him. She stopped short, clearly surprised, and then her face broke into the same genuine smile he remembered from the ball. "Lord Ashford," she said, "I did not expect to find you hiding among the roses." "I prefer to think of it as a strategic retreat," Edmund replied, rising carefully to his feet, his cane steadying him against the uneven ground. "Garden parties present certain difficulties that ballrooms do not." "And what difficulties are those?" "Uneven grass, for one," Edmund said dryly, "and the complete absence of walls to disappear against." Elinor laughed, a warm, unguarded sound that seemed to surprise even her. "I confess I came out here for much the same reason, though my difficulties are somewhat different from yours. I find large gatherings of well-meaning matchmakers rather exhausting." "Ah," Edmund said, "so we are both refugees then." "It would seem so." She glanced at the stone bench behind him, and then, with a small questioning look as though asking permission, gestured toward it. "May I join you, only for a few minutes? I would rather not return to my mother's group quite yet." "Please," Edmund said, gesturing for her to sit, and lowered himself back onto the bench beside her, careful to leave a respectable distance between them, though the bench was hardly large enough to make much difference. For a moment neither of them spoke, and the silence stretched comfortably between them, filled only by the distant sound of the orchestra and the soft rustle of roses in the summer breeze. It was Elinor who broke it first. "I have been thinking about our conversation at Lord Camden's ball," she admitted. "You said something that stayed with me, about watching the room rather than joining it." "Did I?" "You said you were content to watch, that someone must appreciate the music. I have thought of it often since. It seemed, at the time, like a kind thing to say to spare yourself further mockery, but I wondered afterward if there was more truth in it than you intended." Edmund considered this for a long moment, surprised by how easily she had seen through the careful armor of his own words. "There is some truth in it," he admitted finally. "I have grown rather fond of watching over these past years. There is a certain freedom in it, I think. No one expects anything of you when you are simply watching." "And is that enough?" Elinor asked, turning to look at him directly, her eyes searching his face with the same steady, unflinching attention he had noticed the first time they met. "Simply to watch and never to join." Edmund did not answer immediately. It was not a question anyone had asked him so plainly before, and he found himself unprepared for it, unused to the particular honesty of her gaze. "I do not know," he said finally, and it was the truest answer he could offer. "Before the injury, I never imagined a life spent at the edges of rooms. I was, if you can believe it, rather a fine dancer once." "I can believe it," Elinor said, and there was no doubt in her voice, no trace of polite disbelief meant only to flatter him. "You carry yourself like a man who once moved with confidence. I noticed it the first evening we met, before I even knew about your leg. There is a certain grace in how you hold yourself, even now." Edmund felt something shift in his chest at her words, an unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with the summer sun overhead. No one had spoken to him in such terms since his injury. Most conversations about his leg, when they happened at all, were conducted in careful, pitying tones, as though the subject itself were something fragile and dangerous, best avoided or handled with great delicacy. Elinor spoke of it plainly, almost matter-of-factly, as though it were simply one fact among many that made up the whole of who he was, no more shameful than the color of his hair or the sound of his laugh. "You speak of it very easily," he said, unable to keep a note of curiosity from his voice. "Most people either avoid the subject entirely, or address it with such careful sympathy that I find myself wishing they had said nothing at all." "I imagine that grows tiresome," Elinor said. "Being treated as though your injury is the only interesting thing about you, or worse, as though it makes you somehow less than you were before." "It does," Edmund admitted, "though I confess I have grown so used to it that I sometimes forget there might be another way to be treated." Elinor was quiet for a moment, watching a pair of small birds hop along the garden path in search of crumbs. "Perhaps that is something we have in common in a strange way," she said finally. "I do not carry a cane, and I have not fought in any battle, but I know what it is to be reduced to a single fact about myself, again and again, until it feels as though nothing else about me matters at all. For me, it is my age and my unmarried state, and the assumption that both must mean something is wrong with me, some flaw that has kept me from securing a husband." "There is nothing wrong with you," Edmund said, more quickly and more firmly than he had intended, and then, embarrassed by his own vehemence, he added more quietly, "That is, I have found nothing wanting in our two brief conversations." "Quite the opposite, in fact." Elinor turned to look at him again, and this time there was something softer in her expression, something that made Edmund's chest tighten in a way he did not fully understand. "Thank you," she said simply. "That means more than you likely realize." They spoke for nearly half an hour after that, wandering easily from one subject to another, discussing books they had both read, the particular strangeness of certain society customs, the small absurdities of the very party taking place just beyond the hedge that sheltered them. Edmund found, to his growing astonishment, that conversation with Elinor required none of the careful effort he usually spent in social settings, none of the constant awareness of how he might be perceived or judged. She simply spoke to him, and he spoke to her, and the words flowed easily between them, filled with a warmth and honesty he had not experienced in longer than he cared to admit. It was Elinor who eventually noticed the time, glancing toward the sky and sighing with obvious reluctance. "I should return before my mother sends someone searching for me," she said, rising from the bench. "She worries when I disappear for too long." Edmund rose as well, steadying himself against his cane, and for a moment they simply stood facing each other beneath the rose-covered trellis, neither quite ready to end the conversation. "I have enjoyed this afternoon far more than I expected to," Edmund said honestly. "More, I think, than any garden party I have attended in years." "As have I," Elinor replied. "Perhaps we might find ourselves hiding in the same corner again sometime soon." "I would like that very much," Edmund said, and meant it entirely. Elinor smiled once more, that same warm, genuine smile that had first caught his attention across a crowded ballroom, and then she turned and made her way back along the garden path, disappearing behind the tall hedge and rejoining the distant sound of the party beyond. Edmund remained beneath the rose trellis a while longer, watching the space where she had disappeared, and found himself smiling in a way that felt entirely unfamiliar, as though some old, forgotten muscle in his face had finally remembered how to move. For the first time in 3 long years, he found himself looking forward to the next social gathering on the calendar, not with dread, but with something dangerously close to hope. He did not yet know that their quiet afternoon among the roses had not gone entirely unnoticed. Near the edge of the garden, half hidden behind a tall hedge of his own, a young gentleman named Gareth Cole had watched the entire exchange with narrowed eyes and a slowly tightening jaw, his earlier admiration of Miss Hartley curdling, in the space of half an hour, into something far less pleasant. News of any kind traveled quickly through society, but news involving a duke traveled faster still. Within days of the garden party at Pemberton's estate, word spread that Charles Whitmore, Duke of Rothermere, had arrived in the county for an extended visit to his cousin's nearby estate, and that he intended to remain through the entire summer season. The announcement sent a ripple of excitement through every household with an unmarried daughter, for the Duke of Rothermere was, by any measure, one of the most eligible bachelors in the country, possessed of a vast fortune, a handsome face, and a reputation for charm that preceded him into every drawing-room he entered. Elinor had heard of the Duke long before she ever met him, as had everyone else in her circle, but she gave the news little thought beyond a passing curiosity. Dukes, in her experience, rarely took much notice of women like herself, spinsters well past the age when society considered them worth pursuing, no matter how comfortable their independence or how sharp their wit. She expected, if anything, to observe his arrival from a respectful distance, watching younger, more eligible women compete for his attention while she remained, as always, at the edges of the excitement. She was, therefore, entirely unprepared for what happened at the Ashcombe dinner, party held only a week later. The Ashcombe family, wealthy and well-connected, had spared no expense in welcoming the Duke to the county, and their dinner table that evening was set with a grandeur befitting his rank, gleaming silver and fine china arranged beneath the soft glow of dozens of candles. Elinor had been seated, as was often the case at such gatherings, somewhat toward the far end of the table, a placement that generally suited her well, allowing her to observe the evening's conversation without becoming its center. She was surprised, then, when the Duke himself, upon being introduced to the assembled guests before dinner began, made his way directly toward her, bowing with easy elegance. "Miss Hartley," he said, and Elinor was startled that he already knew her name. "I understand you are considered one of the finest conversationalists in this county. I confess, I have been looking forward to testing that reputation myself." Elinor, momentarily flustered by the unexpected attention, managed a polite curtsy. "Your Grace flatters me. I fear my reputation has grown rather larger than my actual talents." "I doubt that very much," the Duke replied, his dark eyes warm with genuine interest. "Modesty, in my experience, is usually the first sign of a truly sharp mind." He remained by her side for a considerable portion of the evening, far longer than courtesy strictly required, engaging her in conversation about literature, travel, and the various follies of society life with an ease and wit that Elinor found genuinely enjoyable, despite her initial surprise. He asked thoughtful questions and seemed to actually listen to her answers, a quality she had not often encountered among the gentlemen of her acquaintance, and by the end of the evening, Elinor found herself reluctantly charmed, though not entirely without reservation. Word of the Duke's obvious interest spread through the county with predictable speed. Within days, Aliner's mother had received no fewer than 3 separate visits from neighbors eager to discuss the exciting possibility of a match between Aliner and the Duke of Rothermere. And Aliner herself began receiving considerably more invitations than usual, as hosts across the county suddenly discovered a great enthusiasm for including her in their gatherings, hoping, no doubt, to secure the Duke's attendance alongside her own. "It is remarkable," Aunt Margaret observed dryly one afternoon, watching yet another invitation arrive by messenger, "how quickly a woman's stock rises the moment a duke shows interest in her, regardless of how little that woman herself has changed." Aliner could not help but agree, though she found the sudden attention more exhausting than flattering. Still, she could not deny that there was something undeniably pleasant about being courted by a man as accomplished and attentive as Charles Whitmore. Over the following weeks, he called upon her regularly, sent thoughtful gifts of books and flowers, and made no secret of his growing admiration, both in private conversation and in public settings where his attention to her could not fail to be noticed. Her mother, predictably, was overjoyed. "A duke, Aliner," she said one evening, her voice trembling with barely contained excitement. "After all these years, a duke has taken notice of you. This is beyond anything we ever dared hope for." "He has taken notice of me, mother," Aliner replied carefully. "That does not mean I have decided to accept him, should he ever ask." "Why ever would you refuse a duke?" her mother asked, genuinely baffled by the possibility. "What more could you possibly want?" Aliner did not have a ready answer to that question, though she found herself thinking, more often than she cared to admit, of quiet conversations beneath rose trellises and a steady, unpitying gaze that had made her feel, for the first time in years, entirely herself. She had not seen Edmund since the garden party, though she had heard, through the usual channels of gossip, that he had retreated once again into the relative privacy of his estate, attending fewer social gatherings than ever. She wondered sometimes whether their afternoon among the roses had meant as much to him as it had to her, or whether it had simply been a pleasant but forgettable exchange, quickly overshadowed by more pressing matters. Edmund, for his part, had indeed withdrawn somewhat from society, though not entirely by choice. His mother had fallen briefly ill in the weeks following the garden party, and Edmund had spent much of his time attending to her care, postponing his own social obligations without much regret. It was only when his mother's health improved that he began, cautiously, to re-enter the world of balls and dinners once more, and it was at one such gathering, a musical evening hosted by Lady Camden, that he first learned of the Duke's growing attachment to Aliner. The news reached him second-hand, in the careless, gossiping tone that always seemed to accompany such information, from a conversation he overheard between 2 young women seated near him during the performance. "They say the Duke is quite besotted with her," one whispered to the other. "Can you imagine, after all these years, Aliner Hartley finally securing such a match?" "I confess I am rather surprised," the other replied, "though I suppose a duke can afford to overlook her age, given his wealth and position." Edmund felt something cold and unwelcome settle in his chest at their words, a feeling he did not immediately recognize, or perhaps did not wish to name. He told himself it was simply surprise, nothing more, and yet the feeling persisted throughout the remainder of the evening, an uncomfortable weight he could not quite set aside. He had no claim on Aliner Hartley, he reminded himself firmly. They had spoken only twice, brief conversations that meant nothing beyond simple friendship, and it was entirely reasonable, entirely expected, that a woman of her beauty and wit should attract the attention of a duke, a man who could offer her everything Edmund could not. A title without scandal, a body without injury, a life free from the whispered mockery that followed Edmund everywhere he went. And yet, as he made his slow way home that evening, leaning heavily on his cane in the darkness, Edmund could not shake the memory of green silk and warm laughter, and a smile that had never once flickered with pity, and he found himself wondering, with a bitterness he was not proud of, whether he had imagined more significance in their afternoon among the roses than had truly existed. It was several weeks later, at a large ball hosted by the Ashcombe family to formally welcome the Duke into county society, that Edmund saw them together for the first time. Elinor stood near the center of the room, radiant in a gown of deep blue, laughing at something the Duke had said, her hand resting lightly on his offered arm as they moved together toward the dance floor. Edmund watched from his usual spot near the edge of the room, his chest tight with a feeling he still refused to properly name, as the Duke led Elinor into a dance, the two of them moving with easy, practiced grace beneath the glittering chandeliers. She looked happy, Edmund thought, watching her smile up at the Duke as they turned through the steps of the dance. She looked, in fact, exactly as a woman should look when courted by a man who could offer her everything. And Edmund found himself remembering, with painful clarity, his own admission to her weeks earlier that he had once been a fine dancer, before the injury that had taken that possibility from him forever. He remained at the edge of the ballroom for the rest of the evening, watching the dancing with the same careful, distant attention he had cultivated over 3 long years, and told himself, with as much conviction as he could manage, that it was better this way. Elinor deserved a man who could stand beside her without a cane, who could dance with her beneath every chandelier in the county, who could offer her a title and a fortune far beyond anything Edmund could provide. It was only much later, as his carriage carried him home through the quiet darkness, that Edmund allowed himself to admit, with considerable reluctance, exactly how much the sight of Elinor in another man's arms had cost him. Despite the growing attention from the Duke, Elinor found that her thoughts returned again and again to Edmund Vane, and though propriety and good sense both suggested she should set such thoughts aside, fate, or perhaps something less mysterious than fate, seemed determined to place the two of them in each other's path throughout the following weeks. The first such meeting occurred quite by accident at the county's small lending library, a modest but well-stocked establishment favored by the more literary-minded members of society. Elinor had gone in search of a particular volume of poetry recommended to her by a friend, and was searching the shelves with growing frustration when a familiar voice spoke from just behind her. "If you are looking for Lord Byron, I believe the librarian has moved the poetry section entirely. Something about a complaint from Mrs. Ashcombe regarding its inappropriate influence on young minds." Elinor turned to find Edmund standing a few feet away, leaning lightly on his cane, an amused expression on his face that suggested he found the library's censorship efforts rather more entertaining than scandalous. She felt her own face break into a smile before she could stop it. "Lord Ashford," she said, "I did not expect to find you among the books." "I am something of a regular here," he admitted. "It is, I find, one of the few social spaces where a cane and a limp attract remarkably little attention. Everyone is far too absorbed in their own reading to notice much of anything else." "A fair point," Elinor said, glancing around at the quiet, book-lined room. "I confess I have missed our conversations. I had hoped to see you at more gatherings this summer." "My mother took ill for a time," Edmund explained. "I have been attending to her care, though she is much recovered now. I understand I have missed a great deal of excitement in the meantime." His tone remained light, but Elinor caught the careful, deliberate way he avoided any direct mention of the Duke. "You have heard about the Duke of Rothermere, then," she said, deciding it was better to address the matter plainly than to dance around it with careful evasions. "I have heard a great deal about the Duke of Rothermere," Edmund admitted. "It seems half the county speaks of little else." Elinor sighed, setting aside the book she had been searching for and turning to face him more fully. "He has been very attentive," she said carefully. "And I will admit, he is a genuinely pleasant man, intelligent and thoughtful in ways I did not entirely expect from someone in his position. But I have not made any decisions regarding his intentions, whatever the gossip may suggest." "You need not explain yourself to me," Edmund said, though something in his voice suggested he was grateful for the explanation nonetheless. "You are entirely free to consider whatever match suits you best, Miss Hartley. I have no claim upon your attention." The words, though gently spoken, landed with an unexpected weight, and Elinor found herself studying his face for a long moment, searching for something beneath the polite, careful surface of his statement. "Perhaps not acclaim," she said slowly, "but I hope at least that we remain friends, regardless of whatever else may happen this season." "Of course," Edmund said, and the warmth returned to his voice, though something in his eyes remained guarded in a way she had not noticed before. "I would value that very much." They spoke for nearly an hour that afternoon, wandering between the library shelves discussing books and poetry, and though the conversation flowed as easily as it always had between them, Alina could not shake the feeling that something had shifted, some careful distance that Edmund had begun placing between them, as though he were protecting himself against a disappointment he had already decided was inevitable. She thought of it often in the days that followed, turning the conversation over in her mind as she went about her usual routines, and found herself growing increasingly frustrated with the entire situation, though she could not quite articulate, even to herself, exactly what troubled her most about it. The second meeting occurred at a charity function held to benefit the county's small hospital, an event that drew a considerably wider cross-section of society than the usual balls and dinners, including a number of former soldiers who had returned from the same conflicts that had claimed Edmund's mobility. Alina had volunteered to help organize the event, working alongside several other ladies to arrange displays of goods for sale and coordinate the afternoon's activities. And it was during a lull in the preparations that she noticed Edmund arriving, along with his friend Frederick Lowe, whom Alina had met briefly on a previous occasion. The two men made their way through the gathering crowd, greeting various acquaintances, and Alina watched with growing anger as several young gentlemen, Peregrine Ashby prominent among them, made a show of stepping aside dramatically to let Edmund pass, as though his cane required an unusually wide berth, accompanied by poorly concealed laughter. Alina felt something hot and sharp rise in her chest at the sight, and before she had quite decided to act, she found herself crossing the room toward them. "Lord Ashford," she said warmly, deliberately raising her voice enough to be heard by those nearby, "I am so glad you could attend. We are in desperate need of someone with a good eye for arranging the book donations. I remember you mentioned an excellent knowledge of literature at the library last week." Edmund glanced at her, clearly surprised by the public nature of her greeting, but recovered quickly, offering her a small, grateful smile. "I would be happy to help, Miss Hartley, though I confess my knowledge extends mainly to poetry rather than the wider field." "That will do splendidly," Alina said, and deliberately looped her arm through his, guiding him toward the table of donated books with a confidence that left the watching group of young men with nothing to say, their earlier amusement dissolving into awkward silence as Alina's clear, public preference for Edmund's company became evident to everyone nearby. "You did not need to do that," Edmund murmured quietly as they moved away from the group, though there was no real objection in his voice, only a kind of stunned gratitude. "I know," Alina replied simply. "I wanted to." They spent much of the afternoon working together at the book table, and Alina found herself laughing more freely than she had in weeks, entirely at ease in Edmund's company despite the watching eyes of the gathered crowd. Frederick Lowe joined them for a time, and Alina liked him immediately, appreciating his quiet, dry humor and the obvious warmth of his friendship with Edmund. "He does not usually smile so much," Frederick told her at one point, when Edmund had briefly stepped away to fetch a box of donated volumes. "Not since the injury." "It is good to see." Alina felt something warm settle in her chest at his words, though she was careful not to let it show too plainly on her face. "He deserves to smile more often," she said simply. "He deserves a great many things that this county has not seen fit to give him." Frederick studied her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read. "I believe you may be exactly what he needs, Miss Hartley," he said quietly, "though I suspect he would never say so himself." The observation stayed with Alina long after the charity event had ended, and she found herself, in the quiet hours of the following evenings, turning it over again and again, wondering whether Frederick's assessment held any truth, and wondering, too, what exactly she intended to do about the growing tangle of feelings she could no longer pretend did not exist. Meanwhile, the Duke's courtship continued, gentle and persistent, and Alina found herself increasingly torn between two very different possibilities. Charles Whitmore offered her security, status, and a genuine, comfortable affection that many women would have considered more than enough reason to accept him without hesitation. He was kind to her, attentive to her interests, and entirely without the careful, guarded distance that had begun creeping into Edmund's manner since the news of the Duke's arrival. And yet, whenever Alina imagined a lifetime spent at Charles Whitmore's side, pleasant as it might be, she could not shake the feeling that something essential would always be missing, some quality of understanding and honesty that she had found, almost by accident, in her conversations with a quiet, injured Earl who watched ballrooms from the shadows and never once looked at her with pity. It was not lost on Alina that her growing feelings placed her in a difficult and delicate position. Society expected her, at nearly 30 years of age and long considered a spinster, to accept the Duke's suit gratefully and without complaint, securing a match that would silence years of whispered pity and speculation regarding her unmarried state. To refuse a duke in favor of an injured earl with a modest fortune and a limp that invited public mockery would be, by every measure society valued, an inexplicable and foolish choice. And yet, as the weeks passed and Alina's feelings for Edmund continued to deepen despite her better judgment, she began to suspect, with growing certainty, that she would rather make an inexplicable and foolish choice than spend the rest of her life wondering what she might have found had she chosen differently. She did not yet know that events already in motion, set into action by a jealous and resentful young man who had watched her walk arm in arm with Edmund at the charity event with mounting fury, would soon force her to make exactly that choice, publicly and without room for hesitation, sooner than she had ever expected. Gareth Cole had never much cared for Edmund Vane, though until recently his dislike had remained a quiet, unremarkable thing, hardly worth mentioning. Gareth was the younger son of a minor baron, possessed of a modest income and an ambitious nature that had, for several years, fixed itself firmly on the idea of securing a wealthy marriage to improve his family's fortunes. He had, in fact, considered courting Alina Hartley himself the previous season, drawn by her comfortable independence and her family's respectable connections, though he had ultimately decided against it, judging her too old and too likely to refuse him in favor of pursuing younger, more promising prospects instead. Watching her walk arm in arm with Edmund at the charity function, laughing easily in his company while the Duke of Rothermere, a genuine prize, waited patiently in the wings, had stirred something ugly and resentful in Gareth's chest. It seemed, to his mind, an almost personal insult that a woman he had once considered beneath his own ambitions should show such obvious preference for a broken, limping Earl over both himself and a duke, and the injustice of it festered in him over the following days, growing steadily into something he could no longer ignore. It was at a gathering of several young gentlemen, held at Peregrine Ashby's townhouse over cards and brandy, that Gareth first spoke of his growing plan. Peregrine, still smarting from Alina's earlier rejection of his own proposal years before, proved a willing and enthusiastic audience. "It seems to me," Gareth said, swirling the brandy in his glass with careful casualness, "that our Lord Ashford has grown rather too comfortable in society lately. Attending charity events, working closely with Miss Hartley, smiling at parties as though he were an ordinary man like the rest of us. Someone ought to remind him of his proper place." "And what place is that?" asked another young man at the table, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer and found the idea rather appealing. "At the edges of the room where he belongs," Gareth said. "Watching, as he always has. I propose we arrange a small entertainment for the Whitmore ball next week. A dance challenge, perhaps one that Lord Ashford simply cannot refuse without appearing a coward before the entire county." The plan, as Gareth outlined it that evening, was cruel in its simplicity. The Whitmore ball, hosted by the Duke's cousin to celebrate his continued visit to the county, would be one of the largest gatherings of the summer season, attended by nearly every notable family in the area. Gareth proposed that, partway through the evening, he and his companions would organize a public dance exhibition, framed as harmless fun, in which several gentlemen would be invited, one by one, to demonstrate a particular difficult dance step before the assembled crowd, with the audience judging and applauding each attempt. Edmund, Gareth reasoned, would be publicly invited to participate alongside the others, and whether he accepted and failed humiliatingly before the entire county, or refused and confirmed once again his reputation as a man too broken and cowardly to even attempt such simple entertainment, the result would be the same. His careful, hard-won dignity, rebuilt slowly over 3 years of quiet suffering, would be shattered in a single public moment, witnessed by everyone whose opinion mattered in county society, including, most importantly to Gareth's petty satisfaction, Eleanor Hartley herself. "It seems rather unkind," one of the younger men at the table said hesitantly, though his objection was weak and easily dismissed by the other's enthusiastic agreement with Gareth's plan. "It is simply good fun," Peregrine said dismissively. "Ashford has grown far too proud lately. This will remind him and everyone else exactly where he stands." The plan was set in motion over the following days, with Gareth and Peregrine quietly recruiting several other young gentlemen to participate in the dance exhibition, careful to frame the entire affair as innocent entertainment rather than the deliberate cruelty it truly was. By the time the evening of the Whitmore ball arrived, word had spread quietly through certain circles that something unusual was planned, though the details remained carefully vague, and Edmund himself, attending the ball with no particular suspicion beyond his usual quiet dread of public gatherings, had no idea what awaited him. The ball began much as any other, with the great hall of the Whitmore estate filled with candlelight and music, and the familiar swirl of silk and laughter. Eleanor arrived with her mother, and found herself, as had become increasingly common throughout the summer, immediately claimed by the attentive company of the Duke, who greeted her warmly and remained close by her side throughout much of the early evening. Edmund, arriving somewhat later, took up his usual position near the edge of the room, watching the dancing with the careful, distant expression he had perfected over 3 long years. He noticed Eleanor across the room, laughing at something the Duke had said, and felt the familiar tightness settle in his chest, though he did his best to ignore it, as he had trained himself to do throughout the summer. It was perhaps an hour into the evening, during a natural lull in the dancing as the orchestra paused between sets, that Gareth Cole made his move. He stepped forward into the open space at the center of the ballroom, raising his voice with practiced confidence to address the assembled crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called, and the room, curious, gradually quieted to listen. "In honor of our esteemed guest, the Duke of Rothermere, and this splendid gathering, several of us gentlemen have arranged a small entertainment. A friendly demonstration of the season's newest dance steps, recently arrived from the continent, judged by the beauty and grace of our lovely audience." A murmur of interested amusement rippled through the crowd, and several young ladies clapped their hands together in delight at the prospect of a new spectacle to enjoy. Edmund, watching from the edge of the room, felt an uneasy prickle of suspicion at the back of his neck, though he could not yet say why. "We shall require several volunteers," Gareth continued, his eyes deliberately sweeping the room before settling, with calculated casualness, on Edmund's distant figure near the wall. "Lord Ashford, perhaps you would honor us. I understand you were once considered quite a fine dancer before your unfortunate injury. Surely you have not forgotten every step entirely." The room's attention turned as one toward Edmund, and he felt the familiar, dreaded weight of dozens of eyes upon him, though this time it carried a far sharper edge than the usual passing mockery he had grown accustomed to. Gareth's request had been framed as a compliment, an invitation, but the cruel intention behind it was unmistakable to anyone paying close attention, and Edmund understood with sinking clarity exactly what was happening. "I fear my dancing days are behind me," Edmund said, keeping his voice as level and unaffected as he could manage, though his cane felt suddenly heavier in his grip. "I would not wish to disappoint such a discerning audience." "Come now, my lord," Gareth pressed, his smile widening in a way that made his true intentions plainer to anyone who cared to look closely. "Surely you would not refuse such a simple request before the Duke and all our finest company. A single dance step, that is all we ask. Or has your courage suffered along with your leg?" A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through parts of the crowd, though Edmund could see, even in his growing distress, that not everyone found the exchange amusing. Frederick Lowe, standing nearby, had gone pale with anger, taking a half-step forward as though to intervene, though Edmund gave a small, subtle shake of his head, unwilling to let his friend suffer public embarrassment on his behalf. Edmund stood frozen at the edge of the ballroom, the familiar heat of humiliation rising in his chest, the same crushing weight he had felt at countless balls over the past 3 years, only sharper now, more deliberate, more publicly cruel than anything he had yet endured. He knew, with dreadful certainty, that whatever he chose to do next, whether he attempted the dance and inevitably failed before the entire room, or refused and confirmed Gareth's careful insinuation of cowardice, the result would be the same crushing public humiliation, witnessed by everyone he knew, including the one person in the room whose opinion had come, over the summer, to matter more to him than he cared to admit. Across the ballroom, Elinor watched the entire exchange unfold with growing horror, her earlier pleasant conversation with the Duke entirely forgotten. She saw Edmund's careful, practiced composure begin to crack at the edges, saw the flicker of genuine pain beneath his forced calm, and felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest, hot and immediate, leaving no room for hesitation. She did not wait to consider the consequences, or to weigh the careful calculations of propriety and reputation that had governed so much of her life until now. She simply moved, crossing the ballroom floor with quick, determined steps, her deep blue gown catching the candlelight as she made her way directly toward the center of the room where Gareth Cole stood smiling his cruel, satisfied smile, waiting for Edmund's inevitable humiliation to unfold before the entire watching crowd. The ballroom fell into startled silence as Elinor crossed the floor, her steps quick and purposeful, drawing every eye in the room away from Edmund and toward herself instead. Gareth Cole's confident smile faltered slightly as she approached, clearly uncertain what to make of her sudden, unexpected intervention. "Miss Hartley," he began, attempting to recover his earlier composure, "we are simply enjoying a bit of harmless entertainment. Lord Ashford was just about to demonstrate his skill, were you not, my lord?" "There is nothing harmless about what you are doing," Elinor said, and her voice, though not raised to a shout, carried clearly across the suddenly silent ballroom, sharp with a controlled anger that left no room for misunderstanding. "You have gathered this entire room to watch a man who fought and bled for this country be mocked for an injury he did not choose and cannot help. I wonder, Mr. Cole, what battle you have fought that gives you the right to judge his courage." A murmur moved through the crowd, and Elinor could see, from the corner of her eye, several faces shifting from amused curiosity to genuine discomfort, as though Gareth's cruel game had suddenly been named for exactly what it was, stripped of the polite fiction that had disguised it as entertainment. "I meant no offense," Gareth said, though his tone had lost much of its earlier confidence, replaced by a defensive edge that betrayed his growing unease at the sudden shift in the room's mood. "It was only a friendly challenge." A friendly challenge does not single out one man before an entire ballroom for the specific purpose of exposing a difficulty he cannot control, Elinor said. "I think everyone here understands the difference perfectly well, whether or not they wish to admit it." The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable, and Elinor could see Gareth searching for some clever response, some way to salvage the situation and turn the room's sympathy back in his favor, but finding, for once, nothing adequate to say. She did not wait for him to recover. Instead, she turned deliberately away from him, crossing the remaining distance toward Edmund, who stood watching her with an expression of stunned, disbelieving gratitude that made her chest ache with tenderness. "Lord Ashford," she said, loudly enough for the entire room to hear, extending her hand toward him with steady, deliberate confidence. "Would you do me the honor of a dance?" A fresh murmur rippled through the crowd, louder this time, filled with genuine surprise rather than the earlier cruel anticipation. Edmund stared at her, clearly torn between astonishment and the familiar, deeply ingrained fear of public failure that 3 years of quiet humiliation had carved into him. "Eleanor," he said quietly, using her given name for the first time, his voice low enough that only she could hear it clearly. "I cannot dance as I once did. I would only embarrass us both." "I am not asking you to dance as you once did," Eleanor replied, just as quietly, holding his gaze with the same steady, unflinching attention she had shown him from the very first evening they met. "I am asking you to dance with me, exactly as you are now. I do not require perfect steps, Edmund. I require only your company." For a long moment, Edmund said nothing, searching her face as though looking for some sign of pity or performance hidden beneath her words, some evidence that she was simply acting out of misplaced sympathy rather than genuine desire. He found none. Her eyes held only quiet, steady certainty, the same honest regard she had shown him from their very first conversation, entirely free of the careful pity that had defined every other interaction he'd endured since his injury. Slowly, deliberately, Edmund reached out and took her offered hand. The orchestra, sensing the shifting mood of the room and perhaps recognizing an opportunity to salvage the evening from Gareth's cruel intentions, began to play a slow, gentle waltz, far removed from the quick, demanding steps that would have been impossible for Edmund to attempt. Eleanor guided him gently onto the dance floor, and together, moving slowly and carefully, adapting each step to accommodate his cane and his careful, measured pace, they began to dance. It was not, by any traditional measure, an elegant or accomplished performance. Edmund's movements were careful and deliberate, far removed from the confident, practiced grace he had once possessed before his injury, and more than once he leaned more heavily on Eleanor's supporting hand than either of them might have preferred. But there was something in the quiet dignity of their slow, unhurried movement across the floor, something in the obvious warmth and genuine connection between them, that silenced the remaining murmurs of the watching crowd far more effectively than any sharp words could have managed. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on Edmund's face throughout the dance, offering him a small, encouraging smile whenever she felt him hesitate, and slowly, gradually, she watched the tension in his shoulders begin to ease, watched something like genuine joy replace the careful fear that had gripped him only minutes before. "You are doing wonderfully," she murmured softly, as they turned slowly beneath the golden chandeliers. "I am doing nothing of the sort," Edmund replied, though there was no bitterness in his voice now, only a note of astonished, reluctant amusement. "But I confess I have not enjoyed a dance this much in 3 years." "Then that is all that matters," Eleanor said simply. Across the ballroom, Charles Whitmore, Duke of Rothermere, watched the entire scene unfold with a growing understanding that settled over him slowly, quietly, without bitterness or resentment. He had genuinely admired Eleanor Hartley throughout the summer season, had found her intelligence and independence refreshing in a world of society women more concerned with status and appearance than genuine connection, and he had allowed himself to hope, cautiously, that she might eventually accept his suit. But watching her now, standing so fiercely and publicly in Edmund's defense, watching the quiet, unguarded warmth that passed between them as they moved slowly across the dance floor, Charles understood, with the clear-eyed honesty that had always been one of his better qualities, exactly what he was witnessing. He had never seen Eleanor look at him the way she was currently looking at Edmund Vane. It was not a comfortable realization, and Charles felt a genuine pang of disappointment as he watched them dance, a small mourning for the possibility he had allowed himself to imagine over the past weeks. But he was, above all else, a man of genuine honor, and he found that his disappointment, while real, carried no real anger with it. Eleanor deserved happiness, and it was increasingly clear, watching the scene before him, exactly where that happiness truly lay. When the dance finally ended, the room erupted into applause, not the polite, obligatory kind that typically followed any dance, but something warmer and more genuine, as though the assembled guests had collectively recognized that they had witnessed something meaningful rather than merely entertaining. Even several of the young men who had gathered earlier to watch Gareth's cruel game unfold now joined in the applause with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm, their earlier amusement at Edmund's expense forgotten entirely. Gareth Cole, standing at the edge of the crowd, watched the scene with an expression of sour, humiliated fury, his carefully planned cruelty having backfired spectacularly before the very audience he had hoped would witness Edmund's downfall. Peregrine Ashby, standing beside him, offered no comfort, clearly unwilling to be associated any further with a scheme that had so thoroughly failed and drawn such public disapproval upon its architect instead. Edmund and Alina remained together for the rest of the evening, no longer concerned with the watching eyes of society, their earlier careful distance entirely dissolved by the events of the dance floor. Alina's mother, watching from across the room with an expression of complicated astonishment, said nothing throughout the remainder of the evening, though Alina could see, in the thoughtful set of her mother's face, that whatever objections she might have once raised regarding a match with an injured Earl over a wealthy duke had been considerably softened by the genuine warmth so evident between her daughter and Lord Ashford. The Duke himself approached them once more before the evening's end, offering Edmund a respectful, genuine handshake, and Alina a warm, sincere smile entirely free of resentment. "I believe I have been rather thoroughly outmatched this evening," he said, with a rueful but good-natured laugh. "I wish you both every happiness." "Truly." "You are very gracious, your grace," Alina said, genuinely touched by his kindness. "I have found in my experience," Charles replied, "that recognizing when one has lost gracefully is nearly as valuable a skill as winning. I suspect I shall find someone equally deserving eventually. In the meantime, I am glad to have witnessed something so genuine tonight, even if it was not, in the end, meant for me." As the ball drew to its close and guests began departing into the cool night air, Edmund walked Alina to her carriage, moving slowly together across the gravel drive, no longer concerned with the careful distance he had once maintained between them. "You did not have to defend me tonight," he said quietly, as they paused beside the waiting carriage. "You risked a great deal, standing against Gareth Cole before the entire county, and refusing the Duke's attention so publicly in my favor." "I did not do it out of obligation," Alina replied, turning to face him fully in the soft moonlight. "I did it because I could not bear to watch you suffer, and because I have come to care for you more deeply than I ever expected to care for anyone." Edmund studied her face for a long moment, searching for words adequate to the feeling rising in his own chest, and found, for once, that his usual careful reserve had entirely deserted him. "Alina," he said softly, "I believe I have fallen in love with you, somewhere between the roses and the library and this ballroom tonight, though I confess I am not entirely certain when it began." Alina's answering smile was radiant in the moonlight, and when she spoke, her voice carried no hesitation at all. "I believe I fell in love with you the very first evening we met," she said, "when you looked at me across a crowded ballroom without a trace of pity, as though I were simply myself, and nothing more and nothing less." News of the events at the Whitmore ball spread through the county even faster than the earlier gossip surrounding the Duke's courtship, though this time the tone of the whispers had shifted entirely. Where once Edmund had been discussed with careless mockery and Alina with polite pity, the story now circulating through every drawing room in the county told of a spinster who had stood boldly against public cruelty, and an injured Earl who had found, at last, someone who saw him clearly and loved him regardless. Gareth Cole found himself, in the weeks that followed, quietly but firmly excluded from many of the social gatherings he had once attended freely, his reputation considerably diminished by his role in the failed humiliation. Several families who had previously welcomed him into their homes now found convenient excuses to withdraw their invitations, and Gareth, understanding at last the cost of his cruelty, retreated from county society for the remainder of the season, his earlier ambitions considerably humbled. Edmund called upon Alina formally the following week, arriving at her family's townhouse with a carefully chosen bouquet of flowers and an unmistakable nervousness that Alina found entirely endearing. Her mother received him warmly, any earlier reservations about his suitability as a match for her daughter having been thoroughly dissolved by the genuine warmth and respect so evident between the two of them, and by the obvious happiness that had returned to Alina's countenance since the events of the Whitmore ball. They spent the afternoon together in the small parlor, speaking of the future with an openness that had been impossible only weeks before, when both of them had carried the careful guardedness of people who expected disappointment more readily than joy. Edmund spoke of his hopes to travel again someday, perhaps to visit the milder climates that his old regimental doctor had once suggested might ease the persistent ache in his leg. And Alina spoke of her own quiet dreams, long set aside as impractical for an unmarried woman, of establishing a small charitable foundation to support soldiers returning from war with injuries similar to Edmund's own. I have watched you struggle against a society that judges you unfairly for something entirely beyond your control, she told him. I should like to spend my life helping others in similar circumstances, find the same understanding and respect that I have come to feel for you. Edmund listened to her speak with growing admiration, marveling at the depth of compassion that had drawn him to her from their very first conversation, and found himself, not for the first time that summer, entirely certain of the decision he had already made in his heart. It was on a quiet afternoon in early autumn, as the leaves along the garden paths of Alina's family estate had just begun to turn gold and amber, that Edmund finally asked the question he had been carrying in his heart since the night of the ball. They walked slowly together through the garden, Alina matching her pace easily to his own careful, measured steps, and when they reached a small stone bench beneath an old oak tree, not unlike the one where they had first spoken privately so many months before, Edmund stopped and turned to face her. "Alina," he said, and though his voice carried a slight tremor of nervousness, his eyes held nothing but steady, certain devotion. "I have spent 3 years believing that my injury had cost me any real chance at happiness, that I was destined to watch life from the edges of every room, never truly participating in the joy that others took for granted. Then I met you, and you looked at me not as a broken man to be pitied, but as a whole person worthy of genuine regard. You have given me back a part of myself I feared I had lost forever." He lowered himself carefully onto one knee, steadying himself against his cane, and reached into his coat pocket to produce a small velvet box. "I do not have a title as grand as a duke's, nor a fortune to rival his," Edmund continued, "but I can offer you a heart that recognizes exactly how remarkable you are, and a life spent trying every single day to deserve the love and respect you have shown me. Alina Hartley, will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Tears gathered in Alina's eyes, though her smile remained radiant, and she reached down to help him rise before answering, unwilling to let him remain kneeling on the hard ground any longer than necessary. "Edmund Vane," she said, her voice thick with emotion but entirely certain, "I have spent 10 years being told that my worth depended on securing a marriage that satisfied society's expectations, and I refused 3 proposals from men who saw me as a means to an end rather than a person to be loved. I choose you not because you are the only man who has ever asked, but because you are the only man who has ever truly seen me. Yes, Edmund. I will marry you, gladly and without a moment's hesitation." The engagement was announced formally at a small gathering held at Alina's family home the following week, attended by close friends and family, rather than the wider society that had once found such entertainment in Edmund's suffering. Frederick Lowe stood proudly beside his old friend throughout the celebration, and Aunt Margaret, never one to hide her satisfaction at being proven right about her niece's good judgment, made certain that everyone present understood exactly how pleased she was with the match. News of the engagement spread quickly through the wider county as well, and the reaction, though mixed among those who still valued title and fortune above genuine happiness, was largely one of warm approval. The story of the lame Earl who had been humiliated at every ball, chosen at last by the prettiest spinster in the county over a duke's attention, became something of a local legend, told and retold throughout the following seasons as a reminder that true worth had little to do with the careful judgments of fashionable society. They were married the following spring, in a small ceremony attended by those who genuinely cared for them rather than those who simply wished to witness a spectacle. Elinor wore a simple gown of pale ivory, far removed from the elaborate silks favored by fashionable brides, and Edmund stood at the altar without his cane for the first time in years, having practiced walking the short distance with careful determination in the weeks leading up to the wedding, supported instead by nothing more than his own quiet resolve, and the knowledge that Elinor waited for him at the end of the aisle, watching him with the same steady, unpitying love she had shown him from their very first meeting. When the ceremony concluded, and they turned to face their assembled friends and family as husband and wife, Edmund found himself thinking back to that first miserable evening at Lord Camden's ball, standing alone near the tall marble pillars while laughter echoed cruelly around him, certain that he would never again know a moment of genuine joy within a crowded ballroom. He could not have imagined, on that lonely evening so many months before, that the very woman who had offered him a small, genuine smile from across the room would one day stand beside him not out of pity, but out of love freely and joyfully chosen, teaching him, in the process, that the truest measure of a person's worth had never depended on how gracefully they could dance, but on the honesty and courage with which they chose to love.